This presentation is a conclusion of our study of the origin and diversity of the chordates. Remember, in class we have explored how scientists have proposed that an ancestral deuterostome gave rise to animals that have notochord. And from this point on, all of the animal diversity we have explored, animals having a notochord, are then considered chordates. I wanted to begin this presentation making reference to the connection between this characteristic, the notochord, and the name chordates, because if you go back and look at the learning objectives for the class, the second objective says apply the characteristics used to classify chordates. And what I mean by this is that I want you to be able to look at characteristics that are important for the classification of chordates, like the ones that appear in this phylogenetic tree, and make those connections. For example, if we are talking about chordates that have vertebra, one of those important characteristics for many chordates, we are going to be calling those animals vertebrates. And for example, if they have just a round mouth, no jaws, we call them the cyclostomes. But if they have jaws that articulate, as we mentioned in class, having an upper jaw, which is the maxilla, and a lower jaw, which is the mandible, then those are going to belong to a different clade, which is known the gnathostomes. As we have moved down these characteristics important to animal classification, we finally arrive at this final characteristic, which is going to be the one of limbs with digits. And that is going to take us to what the tetrapods are going to be. This presentation is about tetrapod diversity and the characteristics that are important to the tetrapods. Trying to navigate to the slide I want to use to continue, and here we are. Okay, so tetrapods are going to have specific adaptations that are going to allow them to move away from water. If you think carefully, every type of animal we've studied so far has a dependence for life in water. If we go to the immediate previous groups, the bony fish, osteichthyes, and the cartilaginous fish, the chondrichthyes, those are all aquatic animals. Most of them live in the ocean. A few of them can live in fresh water. If we go beyond, behind that, and we look at animals such as the invertebrate chordates, tunicates or urochordates, the lancelets, cephalochordates, all of these animals spend their lives in water. They develop and live and breed in water. But now we're looking at tetrapods. And so one of the advantages of having limbs like arms, legs with digits, which will be like fingers or toes, is that these enable an animal to have locomotion away from water, support the body that has to now deal with a greater pressure in terms of the force of gravity in a way that they can still move. So that's an important characteristic for the tetrapods. They also have a neck that allows them to separate the movement of the head with regards to the rest of the body. When you think about fish, fish cannot rotate their heads like we can, in my case, to my left, or to my right, or look up, or look down. So these are important characteristics that provide benefits in terms of finding important resources in the environment, also detecting the presence or absence of danger, like in the form of a predator. There's also going to be a fusion of the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is going to be made by the pelvic bones, and it is going to be to those pelvic bones that in many tetrapods, hind limbs are going to attach, and those are going to be powerful. To give you an example, you can probably move a much heavier object pushing with your legs than you can if you're pushing with hands. If you are one of those health enthusiasts and you go to the gym, you know that the amount of weight you can move with your legs is going to be greater indeed than when you can bench with your arms. And that is important in terms of locomotion as well. There's going to be an absence of gills. Tetrapods, because they are now not living in water, they're actually living surrounded by air, must rely on a different mechanism for bringing oxygen in, and that is going to be allowing the rib cage to expand and allow for air to move in. And it is going to be through air that moves into the lungs that animals will be able to obtain the oxygen they need to survive. There's also going to be an important characteristic, which is the development of ears. Ears are good for detecting the vibrations in the air we recognize as sound. That is also important for surviving and living outside of water. The first group, the first clade of tetrapods is going to be the amphibians. The word amphibian itself makes reference to a double life. Amphi means both. Bians, like biology, means life. So they can have part of their lives living in water, but they can also spend part of their time outside of water on land. And here examples that you may be familiar with would be the salamanders. We have frogs, toads. There are these animals that look like a snake. They're not, they're actually amphibians, the caecilians. And let me think of what other example. I think that pretty much covers all of the main types of amphibians. They are going to have moist skin. And this is important because they can supplement oxygen intake. They do have lungs. They breathe, most of the time, not necessarily through nostrils, but through the mouth, like in the case of frogs and toads. And they can also exchange gas, taking oxygen that diffuses into the fluid covering the skin and then passing it to the layers of skin underneath that slimy, wet layer. They can also get rid of some CO2 that way. So they are supplementing their breathing, the exchange of gases, taking in oxygen, getting rid of CO2, using both lungs and skin. The skin breathing is something we'll explore in greater detail later. It's called the cutaneous breathing. There's also going to be a dependence on water when it comes to fertilization. So these are going to be animals that have eggs, but these eggs are not going to be dried on the outside. They are not completely waterproof, and so they can dehydrate, they can dry out if they are laid outside of water. So these animals are dependent on water for the process of reproduction, for the eggs to develop in an aquatic environment. There are going to be some of these individuals, once the tadpoles hatch, the parents can carry the young on the back. As you can see, the example of this frog, this little black object you see there is going to be one of the tadpoles that are carried. Sometimes they can carry them also in their stomach. Sometimes they can carry their young in the mouth for protection. So that's the amphibians. Then another major clade of tetrapods. Remember, we're talking about animals with 4 limbs, which can be called arms or legs, depending on the position anterior, close to the head. Sometimes they can be called arms in the case of some animals, but those that are crawling on the ground, they're all called legs. Characteristics of the amniotes is going to be this amniotic egg. So one of the things that amniotes can do is even become more and more independent from water, because the amniotic egg is going to be relatively sealed, not completely, but almost sealed. And the animals themselves have an impermeable skin, meaning that they can retain more moisture. They don't dry out if they spend an extensive amount of time away from water, which could happen to a frog or a toad. If it ventures too long too far away from water, they will die because they would just dry out. Not so with the amniotes. And so talking about this amniotic egg, there are going to be different layers to the egg. On the outside, there's going to be a shell. This shell sometimes can be brittle, like in the case of a chicken egg. Sometimes can be flexible, kind of like parchment paper. That is going to be true for many lizards and also for turtles. The shell, however, does do a very good job protecting, keeping the fluids inside of the egg. That still has a need for breathing, for doing gas exchange, and that is going to be one of the functions of the chorion. The chorion is going to allow, chorion is one of those layers you find in the amniotic egg, and it's going to be doing the job of exchanging gases between the embryonic system and the surrounding environment. Notice there's going to be, in this case, an albumin, which is going to be an extra source of nutrients. The yolk sac also has nutrients for the development of the embryo. There's also going to be a sac called the allantois, and this allantois is going to be a place where wastes, nitrogenous wastes, can be stored, kept until the day the animal emerges from the egg. So that's going to be characteristics of the amniotes. Most animals in this clade, if you look at reptiles, are going to have this type of egg that can be laid on the outside. The female releases the eggs after they've been fertilized, and then they can develop. There's going to be mammals which will retain the egg. Most mammals retain the egg inside of the reproductive tract of the female, and it's going to be surrounded by a placenta. And development is going to be a little bit different for these layers you see right here. For example, the yolk is not as necessary for supplying nutrients because a lot of the nutrients will be passed from the mother to the young through the placenta. So there are going to be a few differences, but in general, this is going to be what we see in the amniotic egg. I'm not sure what I did here. Okay, here we go. Reptiles will be one of those examples of amniotes. In the reptile clade, we're going to see the tuataras, which are going to be these primitive-looking lizards. They do have a scale that is, a skin that is covered with scales. And this underlines or highlights, if you want to, the point I was making previously, that the skin of these animals is relatively impermeable, meaning waterproof. These animals can live in desert environments. Here's the tuatara. This is the thorny devil, by the way. I kind of pointed at the wrong animal previously. Here's the tuatara. This is the Australian thorny devil. Snakes also have scales. The scales on something like a tortoise, such as this one you see right here, can be enlarged to add further protection to the backbone of the animal. The backbone usually develops underneath the shell, and it fuses with those large, thick scales. Alligators, crocodiles, and birds are also going to be members of this reptile clade. Most are going to be laying the eggs on land. There's going to be a few exceptions in some snakes, for example, where the eggs are retained and the young are born live. They come out of the reproductive tract of the female already fully developed. But for the most part, eggs are laid on land. Most reptiles are going to be ectothermic, which means that in terms of regulating body heat, they'll have to rely on external sources of heat, hence the name ectothermic. Ecto, outside, thermic, making reference to heat energy. So if they need more heat, the metabolism of these animals is not going to be sufficient to provide what the animal needs. So they have to rely on external sources of heat, such as direct exposure to sunlight, basking in the sun, or sometimes at nighttime you can see reptiles coming to the pavement, which has been heated previously during the day by the sun, and they can absorb radiation by direct contact of the skin with the pavement, and it's how they can warm up their bodies. So that's the reptiles. The birds are going to be endothermic. So if we apply the same reasoning we did before, thermic means heat energy, endo means inside. So the body heat that allows for the reactions, metabolic reactions of these animals is not coming from the outside, but it is actually coming from all of those processes that provide energy for the animal. So heat comes from inside. That is the meaning of endothermic. Their own metabolic reactions provide the heat for these animals to maintain their ideal temperature. Many characteristics of birds are going to enable them to take flight. I want to make reference to one you don't see typed on this side, but you can see here in this slide. The bones of birds are going to be hollow, kind of like spongy. This extra air makes the bone still strong, but lightweight is the word I'm looking for. They're going to be lighter in terms of weight in comparison to the bones of mammals. With lighter bones, the animal doesn't have to spend as much energy staying flying in the air. Another characteristic we can see with birds is that the feathers, which are also made of keratin, and keratin is also a lightweight type of protein, are going to enable the animal to soar and lift up in flight with a lower amount of energy that would be required if the body of the animal was covered with a different type of material. By the way, the feathers and the keratin that these feathers are made of contributes to saving a lot of the heat these animals are releasing from the inside. They don't lose it immediately. A lot of the heat can be trapped and maintained inside for the benefit of the animal. Additional adaptations, they do have a urinary bladder. They do have a way of retaining, saving water, rather than just releasing all of the nitrogenous waste with a lot of water. We'll talk about this. When we talk about excretion, they can produce a concentrated nitrogenous waste. Again, the advantage is that they can save water and they don't have to be as dependent on water. Females can have just one ovary. They are not going to, the ovaries are not going to be coming in pairs like we see with most other bilaterally symmetrical animals. They have small gonads, small reproductive organs, and the beaks have no teeth. That is another characteristic of avian reptiles. When you think about reptiles like crocodiles and you think about snakes, fangs, teeth is one of those things that can be impressive. But in the case of birds, even though they belong to the clade Reptilia, they don't have teeth. Yeah, that's evident. Anyone who's observed a bird up close will be able to say that. And finally, we come to the mammals. The mammals have also derived traits, characteristics that apply only to them, not to be seen in other groups of animals. For example, the ability to produce milk with the aid of mammary glands. Mammary glands are not seen in any other group of animals. So if you study an animal in lab and you're not sure what it is, the skin or the covering was missed, but as you're exploring this specimen that came to you and you discover that there are mammary glands, that's it. You know, this specimen you're studying was a mammal. They also have hair. Here's an adaptation that can help also retain heat. Mammals, like birds, are endothermic. Heat is generated from the inside to provide for that adequate environment for all metabolic reactions to happen. But they don't have to lose it immediately. They can retain a lot of that heat, if necessary, through the hair that covers them. They have a higher metabolic rate. This endothermy, generating heat from inside and maintaining a steady temperature, comes at a high use of energy, so that can be an expensive characteristic for mammals. They do have a larger brain when you look at the skull of mammals in comparison to body size. Is going to be much larger than the skull and the brain of other animals in proportion to their size as well. So what I'm saying is if you have a bird and if you have a mammal and they're about the same size, the brain of the mammal will certainly be larger than the brain of a bird or a reptile or any other animal which also has a brain. Let's take a look at the groups of mammals we have. One is going to be the monotremes. Monotremes are unique in that this is the only group of mammals that produces eggs and the female releases the eggs to the outside. These are egg-laying mammals. One example you see here is the echidna. There's another example of a monotreme, which is going to be the platypus, which lives in Australia. These echidnas and platypus, they do produce milk, but they don't have like nipples, and so there's usually a patch of skin where milk is secreted, and then the young have to extend their tongues out to lick the milk from the female, from the parent. Another group of mammals is going to be the marsupials. What is unique about the marsupials is that they do develop in a placenta. The monotremes don't have a placenta. The eggs are released to the outside. The placenta is necessary for when the embryo develops inside of the uterus. And so these, marsupials that develop inside of the placenta, it's like they have this urgent need to get out, and the young are born while they are still not fully developed. The young are born still early in embryonic development. And so you can see here an example of a type of possum. This animal, if we could see the animal real life, would be actually it's about the size of a bean. Imagine something like a red bean or a black bean. That'll be the size of this animal. It's not really large. It looks larger in the picture, and the nipple is going to be really small. So these animals then, when they come out of the reproductive tract of the female, must find a way inside of a pouch. And this marsupium, the marsupium is the name for the marsupial pouch, is going to be the place where glands that produce milk, secrete milk, usually through a nipple, like you see in this case, are going to be found. And that's where development will continue. Examples of marsupials include kangaroos, koalas, wallabies, and our own marsupial we have in the Americas. We're so proud of it. They're so pretty. No, they're not. The possums. Yeah, that's what we get. Isn't that unfair? Australia gets all the cool looking marsupials, the kangaroos, the koalas, the wombats, the wallabies, and we get possums. Okay, well, I guess to some people, possums are cute, especially when they are young, when they're babies. But anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Let's keep on moving here, class. And finally, we have the eutherians. These are going to be mammals that have a more complex developed placenta for the development of the young. The word eutherian makes reference to a true placenta that really provides the resources necessary for development. So the young are going to be born while they have completed already all the embryonic and fetal development. Many eutherians can produce young that are precocious. When you think, for example, about the birth of a horse, or the birth of a giraffe, the birth of wildebeest in Africa, when those young are born, within a couple of hours, they are ready to move and run and escape predators because they live in places where this kind of a threat happens. Other eutherians don't have that strategy. Instead of having precocious young, they're going to have what we call altricious young. And those are going to be the young that are fragile, dependent on the parents. They're born naked, without fur, or sometimes they have fur like dogs. When dogs and cats are born, they have fur, but they're blind, their ears are covered, so they cannot navigate the environment. They're completely dependent on the parents. But again, what they have in common, both of these kinds of young, those who are ready to run within 2 hours and those who need to depend on nourishment from the parents for many weeks, is that they develop completely inside of the placenta. This final slide is not for you to worry. I'm not going to be teasing you right now. I'm not going to say you have to memorize all of these classes of mammals, but just to give you an idea for the diversity of this group. These are going to be animals that definitely can live in many different places, and the characteristics of the body many times will be able to tell you the types of environmental pressures, environmental constraints they have to deal with. So that is going to be all for now, and I hope that you've had a good time reviewing and studying the characteristics of the chordates. I'll see you in class next time. Goodbye.